The transport ship docked at Station Vareth 9 with a gentle hum, and Kira Vance grabbed her single bag before stepping onto the metal walkway that led into the massive space station known across the galaxy as the Galactic Preserve, a sanctuary that housed the most dangerous creatures from 1,000 different worlds, and she took a deep breath as she looked around at the gleaming corridors stretching before her. She was the first human to ever work here, and she could feel the weight of that fact pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. But she did not let it show on her face as she walked forward with steady steps and a calm expression that hid the excitement burning in her chest. The Velothi were waiting for her at the entrance, their bird-like bodies covered in shimmering blue and silver feathers, their large yellow eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked very much like doubt, and the tallest among them stepped forward, with his wings folded tight against his back. "You are the human," he said, his voice sharp and clipped like the sound of stones clicking together. "I am head curator Thesic, and I will be responsible for your orientation and training during your time at this facility, though I must confess that many of us questioned the wisdom of accepting a human into our ranks." Kira smiled and extended her hand in greeting, a gesture that made several of the Velothi take small steps backward in surprise. "I am Kira Vance, and I promise to work hard and learn everything I can about the creatures in your care." Thesic looked at her hand for a long moment, before reaching out with one taloned foot to touch her fingers in what she assumed was the Velothi version of a handshake. And then he turned and began walking down the corridor with quick bird-like steps that forced Kira to jog slightly to keep up. The Galactic Preserve houses over 3,000 species from across the known galaxy, Thesic explained as they walked past massive viewing windows that showed habitat after habitat, filled with strange and wonderful creatures. Many of these animals come from death worlds, planets so hostile that simply surviving there requires extraordinary adaptations, and we study them here in controlled environments to better understand the diversity of life in our universe. Kira nodded as she listened, her eyes growing wide as she spotted a creature that looked like a giant purple octopus floating through a tank of green liquid, and another habitat held what appeared to be living crystals that pulsed with inner light as they moved slowly across a rocky landscape. "You will begin your work in the lower-risk sections," Thesic continued, feeding the herbivores and cleaning the habitats of creatures that pose minimal danger to handlers, and perhaps after several years of training, you will be permitted to work with more challenging specimens. "Habitat 7? Kira asked, and she saw Thesic freeze mid-step, his feathers rising slightly along his neck in what she recognized as a sign of fear or agitation. "How do you know about Habitat 7? He demanded, turning to face her with his yellow eyes narrowed to thin slits. "I read all the files before I came here," Kira said simply. "I know about the Crothan, and I know that 11 handlers have died trying to care for it. And I know that the creature is sick and getting worse every day because no one can get close enough to help it." Thesic made a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a sigh. "The Crothan in Habitat 7 is classified as an untouchable specimen, which means that no living handler is permitted to enter its enclosure under any circumstances, and all feeding and maintenance is conducted through automated drone systems. But the drones cannot remove the parasites from its mane," Kira said, "and those parasites are slowly killing." "That is correct," Thesic admitted, and for a moment his sharp demeanor softened into something that looked almost like sadness. "The creature we call Specimen 7 is suffering, and we can do nothing to help it, because every being that has ever entered that habitat has died within minutes." They had reached a large circular door marked with warning symbols in a dozen different languages, and Thesic pressed his wing against a scanner that caused the door to slide open with a soft whoosh, revealing a viewing chamber that looked out onto the largest habitat Kira had ever seen. The space was designed to look like an alien savanna, with tall purple grass waving in an artificial breeze, and strange twisted trees dotting the landscape. Massive rocks were scattered across the terrain like the bones of ancient giants. But Kira barely noticed any of these details, because her eyes were fixed on the creature that stood in the center of the habitat. Magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, standing nearly 3 meters tall on 6 powerful legs that ended in claws as long as kitchen knives, and its body was covered in scales that shifted between deep red and burnished gold as it moved. But the most striking feature was its mane. The mane was made of hundreds of long tendrils that should have been glowing with soft bioluminescent light, but instead they hung limp and matted around the creature's massive head, tangled together and covered in dark growths that pulsed with sickly green light. And Kira felt her heart ache at the sight of such a beautiful animal reduced to such a miserable state. "The parasites have been growing for nearly a standard year," Thesic said quietly. "They cause constant pain and itching, and the creature has been rubbing against the rocks trying to remove them, which has only made the matting worse and allowed the parasites to spread deeper into the main tissue." The Crothan turned its head toward the viewing window, and Kira found herself looking into eyes that burned like twin suns, filled with anger and pain and something else that she recognized immediately as loneliness. And in that moment, she made her decision. "I want to groom it," she said, and her voice was calm and steady, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Thesic made a choking sound that might have been laughter or might have been horror. "You want to what?" "I want to enter the habitat and manually remove the parasites from its mane," Kira said. "I have experience working with dangerous animals on Earth, and I believe I can help this creature if you give me the chance." 11 handlers, Thesic said slowly, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. 11 trained professionals from 4 different species, all of them experienced and all of them careful. And every single one of them died screaming within minutes of entering that habitat. "And you think you can succeed?" "Where they all failed. Yes," Kira said simply. Thesic stared at her for a long moment, and then he pulled out a small tablet and began tapping on its surface. "I am required by galactic law to log your request and the circumstances under which it was made, and I am also required to note the probable outcome of your proposed action." "What are you writing?" Kira asked. Thesic looked up at her with eyes that held equal parts respect and pity. "Preemptive cause of death. Human foolishness." Kira laughed, and the sound echoed through the viewing chamber, and caused the great beast in the habitat beyond to turn its burning eyes toward her once again, and she pressed her hand against the glass and made a silent promise to the suffering creature on the other side. "I am coming for you," she whispered, "and I am going to help you whether you want me to or not, because that is what humans do." The next morning, Kira arrived at Habitat 7 carrying a folding chair, a bag of snacks, and a book she had downloaded onto her tablet. And the Velothi guards stationed outside the viewing area watched her with expressions of complete confusion, as she set up her chair right against the transparent barrier that separated the observation deck from the habitat beyond. "What are you doing?" one of the guards asked, his feathers ruffling with uncertainty. "I am going to sit here," Kira replied with a friendly smile, "and I am going to read my book and eat my snacks, and I am going to do this every day until the creature in there gets used to seeing me." The guard looked at his partner, and they exchanged the kind of glance that clearly said they thought the human had lost her mind. But they did not try to stop her as she settled into her chair and opened her book, and began to read in a soft voice that carried through the barrier and into the habitat beyond. The enclosure, the Crothan lifted its massive head and fixed its burning eyes on the strange small creature that had appeared at the edge of its territory. And it watched her with the focused intensity of a predator studying potential prey, its muscles tensed and ready to strike at any moment. But Kira did not look directly at the beast, and she did not make any sudden movements, and she did not show any signs of fear or aggression as she continued to read aloud from her book. in a calm and steady voice that rose and fell like gentle waves on a peaceful shore. The first day passed without incident, and when evening came, Kira packed up her chair and her things and waved goodbye to the Crothon before walking away, leaving the creature staring after her with something that might have been confusion flickering in its fiery eyes. The second day was much the same, except this time Kira brought a small container of food, and she ate her lunch while sitting in her chair. The smell of the food drifted through the air circulation system and into the habitat where the Crothon sniffed at it with its broad nostrils flaring. "The human is back," Fesick said to his assistant as they watched from a monitoring station several corridors away. "She has been sitting there for 6 hours, doing nothing but reading and eating." "Perhaps she has decided not to enter the habitat after all," the assistant suggested hopefully. "No," Fesick replied, his voice heavy with a strange mixture of dread and fascination. "She is doing something, I am certain of it, but I cannot understand what her strategy might be." On the third day, Kira began talking directly to the Crothon, not in the way that scientists speak to test subjects, but in the way that friends speak to each other, telling the creature about her home on Earth and the animals she had worked with there, and the stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was a child. "Lion back on Earth," she said softly, her eyes still carefully avoiding direct contact with the beast's gaze. "His name was Marcus, and everyone said he was too dangerous to handle, but I spent weeks just sitting near his enclosure and talking to him, until one day he came right up to the fence and let me scratch behind his ears." The Crothon had moved closer to the barrier, its massive body lowering into a crouch that could have been preparation for an attack, or could have been simple curiosity, and its matted mane tendrils dragged along the ground as it inched forward, step by careful step. By the fourth day, news of the human's strange behavior had spread throughout the station, and a small crowd of Velothi had gathered in the monitoring room to watch as Kira rose from her chair and walked to the control panel that operated the habitat barrier. "She cannot be serious," someone whispered. "Someone stop her," another voice called out, but no one moved, because they were all frozen in place by a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. Fesick activated the communication system. "Human Kira, I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action, as entering that habitat will almost certainly result in your immediate death." "Thank you for your concern," Kira replied calmly, "but I have made my decision, and I would appreciate it if you would respect my choice." She pressed the button that lowered the barrier, and a section of the transparent wall slid down into the floor with a soft hiss, and warm air from the habitat rushed out to meet her, carrying the scent of alien grass and something else, something wild and dangerous and alive. Kira stepped through the opening, carrying only a soft bristled brush and a container of nutrient-rich oil, and behind her the barrier slid back up into place with a sound that seemed terribly final. The Crothon reacted instantly, its massive body surging forward with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, its claws tearing up chunks of purple grass and soil as it charged toward the tiny human who stood alone and unprotected in its territory. Kira did not run. She dropped to one knee and turned her head to the side, avoiding eye contact, while still keeping the approaching beast in her peripheral vision. And she extended one hand, with the palm facing upward, and the fingers relaxed and open, in a gesture of submission and peace. The Crothon skidded to a halt, mere centimeters from where she knelt, its hot breath washing over her in waves that made her hair flutter and her skin prickle with heat, and its jaws opened to reveal teeth as long as her forearm, gleaming with saliva. In the monitoring room, Fesick was already composing the death report in his mind, choosing the words he would use to describe how the foolish human had walked willingly to her doom. But Kira did not move, and she did not scream, and she did not show any sign of the terror that must have been coursing through her veins, as the most dangerous creature in the galaxy stood close enough to end her life with a single bite. Seconds passed, and those seconds stretched into minutes, and those minutes seemed to last for hours, as the entire station held its collective breath and waited for the violence that everyone knew was coming. The Crothon growled, a sound so deep and powerful that it vibrated through Kira's bones and made her teeth ache. But still, she did not move from her position of humble supplication. 10 minutes passed, and then 20, and then 30, and the Crothon had not attacked, but neither had it retreated, and its burning eyes remained fixed on the small figure kneeling before it, with one hand extended in an offering of trust. 47 minutes, Thesic whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. She has been kneeling there for 47 minutes, and she is still alive. Something happened that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Something that would be studied and discussed and debated for generations to come. Something that changed everything anyone thought they knew about the untouchable beast of Habitat 7. The Crothon sat down. It lowered its massive body to the ground and folded its 6 legs beneath it, and simply sat there, still watching the human with its fiery eyes, but no longer showing any signs of aggression. And a sound began to rumble from deep within its chest that was almost like a question. Kira smiled, and slowly, carefully, she began to raise her head. Kira kept her movements slow and deliberate as she raised the brush so that the Crothon could see it clearly. Holding it out in front of her, like an offering, and speaking in the same calm, gentle voice she had used throughout the past 3 days of sitting outside the barrier. "This is a brush," she said softly. "I am going to use it to help clean your mane, and I promise it will not hurt you. But first, I need you to understand that I am not here to cause you any pain or fear." The Crothon sniffed at the brush, its broad nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of the soft bristles and the wooden handle, and its burning eyes flickered between the strange object and the small creature holding it with such unwavering patience. In the monitoring room, the crowd of Velothi had grown even larger, with scientists and guards and administrators all pressed together, watching the screens with expressions of stunned amazement. And Thesic had forgotten all about composing. Death reports as he stared at the impossible scene unfolding before him. "She is showing it the tool," he murmured. "She is explaining what she is going to do before she does it, as though the creature can understand her words." "Can it understand her?" a young researcher asked. "Crothons are considered to be non-sapient," Thesic replied. "They are intelligent predators, but they do not possess language or higher reasoning capabilities. And yet the way it is responding to her suggests something we may have failed to recognize." Kira had moved on to the container of nutrient-rich oil, opening the lid and holding it out so that the Crothon could smell the contents. "This is a special medicine that will help your mane heal once we remove the parasites, and it might feel a little strange at first, but I think you will find it soothing." The Crothon dipped its massive head and sniffed at the oil, and its matted tendrils brushed against Kira's arm as it moved, leaving trails of warmth on her skin, where the bioluminescent tissue made contact, and she held perfectly still until the creature had satisfied its curiosity and pulled back. "Now I am going to touch your mane," Kira announced. And she reached out with one hand, moving so slowly that it seemed to take forever, before her fingers finally made contact with the tangled mass of tendrils. The Crothon made a sound. It was the same deep rumbling growl that had preceded the deaths of every previous handler. And in the monitoring room, several Velothi covered their eyes with their wings because they could not bear to watch what they believed was about to happen. But Kira did not pull away, and instead she began to hum. The melody was an old Earth lullaby, something her grandmother had sung to her when she was small and frightened of the dark. And the simple tune filled the air of the habitat with a sweetness that seemed to wrap around both the human and the beast, like a warm blanket on a cold night. The Crawdon's growl changed, shifted, transformed into something deeper and more rhythmic, that seemed almost to match the melody Kira was humming, and its massive body relaxed slightly as the tension drained from its muscles. "That is it," Kira whispered between hummed notes. "That is very good. You are being so brave, and I am so proud of you." She began to work the brush through the outermost layer of matted tendrils, moving with infinite patience as she teased apart the tangled strands and gently removed the dark parasitic growths that had been causing the creature so much pain. The parasites fell to the ground like drops of poisoned rain, and everywhere Kira cleared them away, the main tendrils began to glow with soft golden light, as though the creature's very life force was returning to the damaged tissue. "She is doing it," the young researcher breathed, and his voice cracked with emotion. "She is actually grooming the untouchable beast, and it is letting her." Tessic could not speak because his throat had closed up with feelings he did not know how to name, and he watched in silence as the human continued her impossible work with steady hands and a gentle voice that never wavered. "You have been so lonely," Kira said to the Crothan as she worked her way deeper into the matted mane. "I can see it in your eyes, and I understand, because I have been lonely too. But you do not have to be alone anymore, because I am here now, and I am not going to leave you." The creature made a sound that was almost like a sigh, and its burning eyes began to close as it surrendered to the soothing rhythm of the brush and the calming melody of Kira's humming, and its massive body settled lower to the ground until it was lying almost flat, with its head resting near Kira's knees. "The human speaks to it as though it understands," Tessic said finally, finding his voice at last. "To it as though it is a person." "Perhaps that is her secret," said an elderly Velothi scientist who had been watching from the back of the room. "Perhaps humans are able to connect with other creatures because they treat them not as animals or specimens, but as individuals worthy of respect and compassion." "But that is irrational," Fesic protested. "The creature cannot understand her words, and it certainly cannot reciprocate her emotional investment. And yet, it is lying at her feet like a tamed pet, while she removes parasites that have been tormenting it for a year," the elderly scientist replied. "Perhaps rationality is not always the most effective approach." Hours passed as Kira continued her work, and the pile of discarded parasites grew larger, while the Crothan's mane grew brighter. By the time she had finished, the creature was glowing like a small sun, with hundreds of healthy tendrils waving gently in the artificial breeze. Brush and opened the container of healing oil, and she began to massage the nutrient-rich liquid into the newly cleaned mane tissue, and the Crothan made a sound of pure contentment that rumbled through the habitat like distant thunder. "There you go," Kira said softly. "That was not so bad, was it?" And then the Crothan did something that shocked everyone watching even more than anything that had come before, something that would be talked about in scientific circles for decades to come. It rolled over. The massive predator, the untouchable beast that had killed 11 handlers, the most dangerous creature in the Galactic Preserve, rolled onto its back and exposed its vulnerable belly to the tiny human who had just spent hours grooming its mane. Kira laughed with pure joy and reached down to scratch the soft scales of the creature's underside. "Oh, you big softy," she said through her laughter. "You just needed someone to take care of you." "Not?" In the monitoring room, Thesic sat down heavily on a nearby bench because his legs would no longer support him. "I do not understand," he said to no one in particular. "I do not understand how this is possible." The elderly scientist placed a gentle wing on his shoulder. "Perhaps understanding is not necessary," she said kindly. "Perhaps some things simply need to be accepted and appreciated for the miracles they are." And in Habitat 7, a human and a monster lay together in the purple grass, one grooming and one purring, and neither of them cared about the hundreds of eyes watching them through the cameras, because in that moment nothing existed except the bond that had formed between two lonely souls who had finally found each other. 3 weeks had passed since the day Kira first entered Habitat 7, and in that time, everything about the Galactic Preserve had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. And the creature that had once been feared by everyone on the station had become something of a celebrity among the staff. Kira arrived at the habitat entrance every morning at exactly the same time, and every morning the Crothon was already waiting for her, its massive body pressed against the barrier, and its newly healthy mane tendrils glowing with warm golden light that pulsed brighter the moment it spotted her approaching. "Good morning, Solace," Kira called out, and the creature she had named made a deep rumbling sound that the Valathi scientists had learned to recognize as a greeting. "You cannot name a specimen," Thesic had protested when Kira first announced the name she had chosen. "It is unprofessional, and it creates an unhealthy emotional attachment that could cloud your judgment." "Scientific judgment. Everything deserves a name," Kira had replied simply, "and I think she likes it, do you not, Solace?" The Crothon had responded by pressing its massive head against Kira's shoulder in what was clearly a gesture of affection. And Thesic had thrown his wings up in exasperation and walked away, muttering about the impossibility of reasoning with humans. The transformation in Solace's health had been remarkable and rapid, with her scales growing shinier and her eyes burning brighter with each passing day. And the behavioral changes were even more dramatic than the physical ones. The creature that had once hurled itself against the barriers of its enclosure in fits of rage now spent most of its time lying peacefully in the purple grass or following Kira around the habitat like an enormous and terrifying puppy. And the feeding drones that had once been attacked on sight were now ignored completely, as Solace had learned to accept food directly from Kira's hands. The aggression was never about hatred or violence, Kira explained to a group of fascinated Valathi researchers who had requested permission to observe her methods. Solace was afraid, and in pain, and desperately lonely, and she lashed out because she did not know any other way to communicate her distress. "But how did you know that?" one of the researchers asked. "How could you possibly have guessed that the creature's behavior was driven by loneliness rather than predatory instinct?" Kira smiled and scratched behind one of Solace's massive ears, causing the creature to lean into her touch with a rumble of contentment. "I did not guess," she said. "I recognized it, because I have seen the same thing in animals back on Earth, and I have felt the same thing in myself." The junior researcher tilted his head in confusion. "You have felt like attacking people?" "I have felt scared and alone and unable to express what I needed. And I have learned that sometimes the creatures who seem the most dangerous are really just the ones who need the most love." It was on a quiet afternoon, 3 weeks and 4 days after the first grooming session, that everything changed again. And this time, the change came in the form of a disaster that no one saw coming. Kira was walking through the corridor that connected Habitat 7 to the main research wing, reviewing notes on her tablet and humming the same lullaby she always hummed when she was with Solace, when the alarms began to blare. Red lights flashed along the ceiling, and a computerized voice announced that there had been a containment breach in Habitat 12. And Kira looked up from her tablet just in time to see a ventilation grate burst open directly in front of her. Out of the opening poured a swarm of sketh crawlers, creatures the size of large rats with armored bodies and venomous stingers that could kill most species within minutes. Were dozens of them, flooding into the corridor and blocking her path to safety. Kira backed away slowly, knowing that sudden movements could trigger a swarm attack. But the creatures were already agitated from their escape, and they began to advance toward her, with their stingers raised and their mandibles clicking. She was trapped. The corridor behind her ended at the barrier to Habitat 7, and there was no time to open it and slip inside. And even if she could, the Valathi protocols were clear that habitats should never be opened during a containment breach to prevent cross-contamination of specimens. The sketh crawlers surged forward, and Kira raised her arms to protect her face and braced herself for the pain that was surely coming. And then the world exploded. The barrier behind her shattered into a million pieces as something massive crashed through it with the force of a small starship. And Kira was knocked to the ground by the shockwave as an enormous shape flew over her and landed between her and the swarm. Solace, the Crothon, had broken through the emergency barrier that was supposed to be strong enough to withstand orbital bombardment. And she stood in the corridor with her mane blazing like a golden star and her jaws open in a roar that was so loud it shook the walls and cracked the floor tiles. The Sketh crawlers scattered in every direction, their primitive instincts screaming at them to flee from the apex predator that had suddenly appeared in their midst. And within seconds, the swarm had disappeared back into the ventilation system, fleeing deeper into the station where they would eventually be rounded up by security teams. Solace stopped roaring and turned to look at Kira, her burning eyes scanning the human from head to toe as though checking for injuries. And when she was satisfied that her friend was unharmed, she made a soft crooning sound and lowered her massive head to nuzzle against Kira's chest. "You saved me," Kira whispered, wrapping her arms as far as they would go around Solace's thick neck. "You crazy, beautiful monster. You saved my life." Security teams arrived minutes later to find the human and the Crothon sitting together in the middle of the destroyed corridor. And Thesic pushed his way through the crowd of guards to stare at the scene with eyes that seemed unable to process what they were seeing. "The barrier was rated to withstand a Class 5 explosion," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "Nothing should have been able to break through it." "She heard me scream," Kira said, and her voice was thick with tears. "She heard me scream, and she came to save me." Thesic looked at the creature that had once been classified as untouchable, the beast that he had believed was nothing more than a mindless killing machine, and he watched as it pressed its forehead against Kira's shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible. For something so large and so powerful. "The untouchable beast," he said slowly, as though the words were difficult to speak, "just saved its zookeeper." A young researcher standing nearby asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Sir, what do we do now?" Thesic was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried a note of wonder that none of his colleagues had ever heard before. "Now we learn," he said. "Now we try to understand what the human has taught us." Kira smiled through her tears and pressed a kiss to Solace's glowing mane. "You are such a good girl," she murmured. "You are the best girl in the whole galaxy." And Solace purred. The great hall of the Galactic Biological Council was filled with representatives from over 200 species, their varied forms occupying seats and perches and hovering platforms that had been designed to accommodate the incredible diversity of intelligent life in the known galaxy. And Thesic stood at the central podium with his wings trembling slightly from nerves as he prepared to deliver the most important presentation of his career. "Honored colleagues," he began, his voice amplified by the translation systems that converted his words into hundreds of languages simultaneously. "I come before you today to report on findings that have fundamentally altered our understanding of interspecies relations and the nature of sapient behavior." He activated the holographic display behind him, and the image of Solace appeared in glowing detail, her magnificent mane shining with healthy bioluminescent light, and her burning eyes looking almost peaceful. "Crothon," Thesic continued, "a species we classified as non-sapient apex predators, creatures of pure instinct, with no capacity for emotional connection or social bonding. And for decades, we believed that the only way to manage them was through strict isolation and automated care protocols." He changed the image to show Kira sitting in the habitat, with Solace's massive head resting in her lap, her hands gently working through the glowing tendrils, while the creature's eyes were closed in obvious contentment. "We were wrong," a murmur rippled through the assembly, and thousands of eyes and optical sensors and other sensory organs focused more intently on the Velothi scientist at the podium. The human you see in this image arrived at our facility 4 standard months ago, Thesic said, and within weeks she had accomplished something that 11 experienced handlers from 4 different species had died attempting, and she did it using methods that we had never employed before, thought to try, because they seemed too simple and too foolish to possibly work. He paused and looked out at the assembled dignitaries. She talked to the creature. She sat with it. She showed it patience and kindness. And she treated it not as a specimen to be studied, but as an individual worthy of respect and compassion. A Trilaxian delegate raised one of its many tentacles to ask a question. Are you suggesting that humans possess some form of telepathic ability that allows them to communicate with non-sapient species? No, Thesic replied. Humans have no telepathic abilities whatsoever, and that is precisely what makes their method so remarkable, because they achieve connection not through any supernatural gift, but through the simple and profound act of caring. He changed the display again to show a series of images documenting Kira's work with Solace over the past months, from the first tense days of sitting outside the barrier to the recent incident, where the Crothon had crashed through an emergency barrier to save her human companion. We have studied this phenomenon extensively, Thesic said, and we have discovered that humans possess a psychological trait that we had previously categorized as a deficiency, but which we now recognize as perhaps the most powerful tool for interspecies diplomacy in existence. He let the silence hang for a moment before speaking the word that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. Love. The hall erupted in a chaos of clicking and chirping and humming as hundreds of species tried to process what the Velothi scientist had just said. And Thesic waited patiently for the noise to die down before continuing. Humans form emotional bonds with creatures that could easily destroy them, he explained. They look at predators and see potential friends. They look at monsters and see lonely souls in need of compassion. And they invest their hearts in beings that cannot reciprocate their affection in any way that we would consider meaningful. He pulled up historical data from Earth, images and records that the human Kira had provided during her interviews with the research team. On their homeworld, humans took wolves and turned them into loyal companions. They befriended creatures with claws and fangs and venom. And they mourned the deaths of animals they had never even met, because they felt a connection to all living things that transcended the boundaries of species and sapience. A stern-looking Vethrat counselor spoke up. This sounds like a mental illness rather than a gift. I thought so too, Thesic admitted. When Kira first volunteered to groom the Crothon, I logged her probable cause of death as human foolishness, because I believed that only someone with a defective survival instinct would willingly enter a habitat with a creature that had killed 11 handlers. The one who was deficient, because I could not see what Kira saw. I could not recognize the loneliness behind the aggression, or the pain behind the violence, and I certainly could not have done what she did, to heal both. Thesic straightened his posture and spoke with conviction. Humans are not foolish, they are not defective, and they are not suffering from some form of collective madness. They are simply capable of a type of connection that most species have never developed, because we were too focused on survival, and logic, and self-preservation. He looked directly into the recording devices that were broadcasting his presentation across the galaxy. The human word for what they do is love, and it is not a weakness, it is a superpower. The presentation continued for another hour, as Thesic detailed the behavioral changes in Solace, and the new protocols that the Galactic Preserve was implementing based on Kira's methods. And by the time he finished, the Council had voted unanimously to request additional human staff for wildlife facilities across the galaxy. The official classification of human foolishness was formally changed to human courage, and a new field of study was established called empathic interspecies communication, with Kira Vance named as the founding expert. But Kira did not care much about titles or classifications or galactic recognition. because she was sitting in Habitat 7 with Solace's massive head in her lap, working her brush through the glowing mane, just as she did every afternoon. Thesic appeared at the viewing window and watched them for a long moment before speaking. The council was very impressed by my presentation, and they have asked me to extend an invitation for you to address the full assembly at their next session. Kira smiled, without looking up from her grooming. That sounds nice, but I think I will be busy. Busy doing what? Brushing Solace's mane, Kira replied simply. She gets anxious if I skip our afternoon sessions. Thesic made the Velothi equivalent of a sigh. You truly are not afraid of her, are you? Kira finally looked up, and her eyes were warm with affection as she scratched behind one of Solace's enormous ears. She is not scary, she said. She was just lonely. Solace made a rumbling sound of agreement and pressed closer to her human friend. Everything that bites is just something that has not been loved right yet, Kira continued, looking at the Velothi with a gentle smile. That is what my grandmother used to say, and I have never found it to be wrong. Thesic recorded her words, as he had been doing ever since he realized that the human's simple wisdom contained truths that his species had never thought to consider. I suspect your grandmother's words will be studied for centuries, he said. Kira laughed and returned her attention to Solace's mane. Softly. She always did love animals. And in the warm light of the habitat, surrounded by purple grass and twisted trees and the soft glow of an alien sun, a human and a monster sat together in perfect peace, proving to a watching galaxy that the greatest power in the universe was not weapons or technology or superior intelligence. It was simply the willingness to love something that everyone else had given up on.